I want to thank Alan and the committee for this honor. I want to thank Terry for the introduction, and most important, I got to tell you, if you've ever coached and somebody retires, somebody gets into Hall of Fame, and players come back from 15, 20, 25 years ago, there's a group of people in the back, and I'm going to ask them to stand, all of you. They played for me between 53 and 58 years ago. John Weinstein, Pete Syme, Richie Lessig, Larry Davidson, would you guys stand, please? Frank Papolino on my left, Lee Alfonso, and my assistant coach, who, by the way, coached for nothing and was always aggravated about that till I told him that the first year I coached for nothing, Jimmy Casper. I've been very fortunate to have two careers. Most people go their whole lives looking for one thing they love. I had two things. One was coaching, and one was writing for Newsday. And ironically, even though coaches and writers are sometimes adversaries, there's a lot of similarities, and one of them is the stories, okay? Our first lacrosse team, the club, we had 20 people, 12 never had a stick in their hand before. We lost our first game 22-4 against the Suffolk Lacrosse Club. We won our last game against the Suffolk Lacrosse Club 13-12. That's how much they improved over the year. And when people talk about the national championships we won, I laugh. Best job I ever did was with that first group when we were 6-4. National champions and the championships are nice, but we were loaded. I had 17 players that I coached who went on to be Division I All-Americans. And I don't want to finish, I don't want to skip this. Sitting over on the side with a powder blue shirt and no tie, and that's why I envy him, is my son Lou, who was an All-American lacrosse player at Amherst College. And by the way, an All-American high school, he made the Jewish All-American high school team when he was at Lynbrook. One of the things I learned from coaching and writing is that most of the time we miss the big story. We become functionaries of numbers. I mean, I love ESPN when they do so-and-so had the most points scored on a Tuesday before dinner. You know, or the most double-doubles by a guy who had a sprained ankle. Right? And the stories are very, very much deeper. I'm going to give you a perfect example. I had an old dear friend named Don Red Goldstein. There may be some of you old folks in here who remember Don. He was a great basketball player. He was a star at Tilden High School in the city. He was a star at Louisville, where he took Louisville to their first Final Four and their first win over Kentucky. And he was drafted, he was All-American. He started on a Pan American team, and the backcourt was Jerry West and Oscar Robertson. What happened is he was drafted 8th in the NBA draft. And you know what he did? He turned it down. And he got a full scholarship to dental school. Now let me tell you about the real Don Goldstein. Not the one who averaged 25 points and 15 rebounds, and you would never have known that. Don Goldstein was born to two parents who were deaf mutes. Two of them. For those of you who don't know what that means, is they couldn't speak and they couldn't hear. His mother was institutionalized, and when he was 4 years old, his father was deemed not old enough to take care of him. So he was given to his grandmother and his grandfather, who spoke not a word of English, only Yiddish. Actually, I wish I had him at my table when I was a kid, because my grandparents and aunts and uncles would be telling these stories in English, and then when they got to the punchline, they'd switch to Yiddish, and we didn't know what they were talking about. Some of you here may have experienced it. Anyway, this is what he did. He graduated from dental school. He was in practice for 40 years. This Jewish boy from Brooklyn moves to Jupiter, Florida, and 2 days a week, at 5 o'clock in the morning, he would drive the 45, 50 minutes to Delray, to the Queen of Peace Catholic Church. And he spent 10 years doing dental work for migrant workers who were picking vegetables and fruit from the fields in Florida. I had a cavity one time. He says to me, come down at 6 in the morning. I got there at 6 in the morning. It was pitch black. I was 15th online. He used to have 3 chairs working and 3 assistants, and he'd go from patient to patient to patient. And when it was at this patient, there was another one back in the front, and he's back over here. That was my friend Don Goldstein. Everybody thinks of him as a great basketball player. I think of him as a great human being, but that part of the story was never told. And that's what I loved about being a writer. I loved delving deeper into the stories. I like the story about Jimmy Wolf, who was a legally blind lacrosse player at Massapequa High School, wound up being a captain at Michigan State. And I said to him, Jimmy, when I was interviewing, how can you see the ball? He says, there's a particular angle where if I stand at, I can see the attack man. And if I can see him, I raise my stick, and he knows I'm open. And then I cut down that line, catch the ball, and score. I love the story about Marty Rieger. Marty Reed, Bunky Reed. He's a coach at Westbury. And I followed him around for a half a year when he was dying. And the year he had late-stage cancer and was dying, they also won the New York State Championship. And the stories that we could read is about how his players, during the weekends, would go over to the house and sit by his bed. Or after class, between classes, if he had a study hall, he ran down to the basement. And the janitor had a bed set up for him, so he could rest for an hour between the next class. Those are the stories. They're about sports people, but they aren't sports stories. Lastly, I want to talk quickly about my family who has supported me for many years. My wife, Mary, who's sitting in the audience, in a month we'll be married 60 years. That could take a clap. And she often says they were 3 of the happiest years of her life. But I want to take it a step further. There's a few people in here who know the story, but I'm telling it again anyway. 40 years ago, 40, excuse my voice, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. 40 years ago, it was a death sentence. After she had surgery, one of the nurses came out and said, we're hoping to get her 5 years. It's 40 years later, and she's sitting right there. My life has been a blessing, and this award is one more nice part of it, and I want to thank Alan and all of you for listening.
Thank you, Terry. I'm glad Mike mentioned about Don Goldstein. Marty Rieger used to tell me about him, and I knew part of that, but I didn't know the whole story. Thank you for that. Our next inductee